Sauce with Judy Mars. I'm Judy Mars, and this show is going to be all about me. And you, of course. So, when I was a little girl, I didn't really like my born name. You know, my born name is Julia. Don't try to Google me, but you can. I know you will, so that's okay. But my born name is Julia. And when I was growing up, I was a different kind of kid. You know, I was like more of a tomboy, more of a pants kind of rolling in the dirt, kind of like getting all grubby, kind of getting all messy kind of kid. So when I was in elementary school, I told my mom I didn't want to be called Julia anymore. I wanted to be called something else. So I wanted to be called something that was not a girly name, you know, or a boy name, more just like something that represented me. So what I did was, I remember I was about maybe 6 or 8 years old. I was sitting at the dinner table with my mom, and I grew up with a single mom. So we were sitting at the dinner table, and I looked at her and I said, I don't want to be called Julia anymore. And she looked at me and she said, well, what do you want to be called? And so I remember telling her my favorite letters. My favorite letters were Z, O, and N. So we were coming up with all these different combinations of how those letters could be used. And finally, we came up with the nickname Zune. So for my entire elementary school experience, including my high school experience until I was about maybe, I don't know, like in my professional career, when I graduated, you know, started going to college, like when I went to college, I was called Zune. And I think it's so wonderful when parents respect their kids' you know, requests when they're growing up, because it's so vital to you know, your development as a child. So honey, I was like, you know, living, because I didn't have to identify with the name Julia until I was much older, until I started creating a resume and all that kind of stuff. But I think back on it now, and I want to connect it to Judy Mars, because how was Judy Mars created? Judy Mars is really a compilation of, or a combination of both of my names, you know, like Julia, Zune. A lot of people call me Zuni, so that makes Junie. And plus I was born in June, honey, so there you go. And Mars, well, to be honest, growing up, you know, as I was really alone, right? Because I was growing up as an only child. On my mother's side, there was only one of me, meaning my mom's siblings had no children. I had no cousins. I had nothing, honey. I was like alone. And it was hard for me to be an only child and not have cousins. On my dad's side, honey, he was a Rolling Stone. Daddy was a Rolling Stone. Papa was a Rolling Stone. I had 8 siblings, so I'm the youngest. But all of them are way, way, way older than me. So I'm talking about my youngest brother, who's closest to me in age. He's almost 10 years older than me, 9 years, 10 years older than me. My parents had me when they were, you know, older. So they had me when my mom was 43, my dad was 50. So you can imagine growing up with older parents if that happened to you. And it was tough, because it was hard to really connect with them, to identify with them. And then when I went to family events, it was like a little tough too, because I was like, you know, I was like this little kid running around. The majority of the people that were there were adults, and I really had no one to interact with. So I started to feel as a middle school student, as a teenager, as as even an adult coming out and being gay, that I was an outsider. You know, like I was from another planet, because I really felt like there was no one I could identify with. And on top of that, on my mom's side of their family, everyone is light. Very, you know, light, black, African American. And on my dad's side, everybody is like me, chocolatey. But because I grew up with my mom, the majority of times that I would go to family events, it was with her. So for a long time, because nobody in my family really looked like me, nobody was my complexion, I started to feel like a black bean straight up in chickpeas. And if you have that image, you know what I'm talking about if you had those different kinds of beans. Meaning that I was the darkest one growing up. My grandmother even said, my mom told me this story, that when I was born, my grandmother held me and she said, wow, this is the darkest baby I ever held in my entire life. And so, you know, it was very rare on my mom's side of the family to be that dark. So I felt very different, and I felt like almost that I was adopted. And so growing up, having those experiences, feeling kind of like I didn't look like my mom. I saw my dad sometimes, and when I saw him, I kind of looked like him, but I thought because of all those things I was adopted. Honey, I used to ask my mom, am I adopted? Because I don't really look like you. I don't really look like anybody in, you know, in the family. And she would just laugh at me. But because of that, because I started to feel also in the queer community, in the gay community, that I didn't identify as either, you know, we have different definitions. We have masculine kind of center women who may identify as butch. I think the term queer is a really interesting term because it sort of encompasses everything, right? Like you can be queer and androgynous, you can be queer and more feminine, you can be queer and more masculine, but it's sort of like an umbrella term. And, you know, growing up, I knew I was different, but I couldn't put my finger on it. And then when I came out and I was like, oh, I'm gay, you know, I felt like, well, which side am I going to identify with? Because even in the queer community, even in the gay community, there are still divisions. So I started to feel like, well, maybe I got to be super masculine in order to be recognized as gay. Because I remember when I first came out, a lot of people said to me, wow, you don't look gay. I mean, whatever that means. But because of that, you know, I started to feel like, well, maybe I got to really assert my queerness, my gayness, and I have to figure out how to do that. So I started to feel from all of my experiences growing up as an only child, growing up, you know, with no cousins, growing up not looking like my mom, growing up with older parents, I started to feel like a real outsider, like a real kind of alien, like really different. You know, and I remember in high school, a lot of black girls, because I have really long hair, would say things to me like, oh, you don't really look black, or because of my facial features, they would say, oh, you don't really look black, or you don't have black girl lips, or you know, your facial features look different, are you sure you're black, or what are you mixed with? And hearing all those comments, it really started to affect me, and I felt like I couldn't just be, you know, and that is so important when you're growing up, honey, because we already have enough from the media, but you know, when you go to school and you hear so much about what you should look like, or you can't identify with any group in your school, you start to feel like an outsider. So Junie Mars is a combination of all of my experiences, okay? Like all of my experiences throughout life, Junie Mars represents that. And Mars because being an outsider, feeling like an alien, feeling alienated, not feeling black enough for the black people growing up in New York City, and not feeling, you know, like I could mix with white people because, you know. But because of all those things, I really felt just different. And so if you're someone who's felt different before, if you felt like an outsider before, if you felt like you on another planet and people just aren't getting you, I get you. I feel you. This is Junie Mars. You've been listening to All Up in the Sauce with Junie Mars. Remember, always keep it saucy, baby. No matter what, be you. And if you don't see it, create it. Right? That's what we're here for. Love you. Have a great, beautiful day.
You are now listening to a Junie Mars production. Oh, honey.